Hi guys, welcome to our new playlist which we will be launching today. The playlist name is of Product Architect. Now, why we will call this Product Architect is this will be a very informative video, and let's type out what we will be doing in this video. So, first we will create a REST API in C#. Let me zoom in a little for you guys so that it is visible to you. So we will create a REST API in C#. Secondly, we will be using code first approach and entity framework core to create this REST API. Once we create this API, we will be testing it. We will be testing it in Swagger, or also we can use Postman, but I will prefer to use the Swagger only. So Swagger is basically the default API testing template provided by REST API in C# in ASP.NET Core. So we will use Swagger only, but we can test in both Swagger and Postman. Now this API which we have created, for this we will create a API testing automation framework. We will create a API testing automation framework in RestSharp. So guys, this is the 4 objectives of today's session. We will create a REST API in C#. We will be using code first approach and entity framework code to create this REST API. Once we create this REST API, we will be testing it manually using the Swagger. And after testing it, we will create a API testing automation framework in RestSharp. So without wasting much of time, let's get started and see how we can do it. So since we will be creating the REST API and then we will be creating the API testing framework in RestSharp, both of the tasks we will be doing together. That is why I have called this playlist as a Product Architect playlist. So let's create our project. Okay. Let's create a new project. Let's use the template of ASP.NET Core Web API. Let's call this API as our, let's say we'll call it employee API. Let's do next. Let's select the .NET 6.0 version. Let's create it. And yeah, a project is being created. Okay. Let it get created, guys. Okay. So it is created. Let's check the solution explorer, and yeah, we get the default file structures. This weather forecast is by default present here. We have other program.cs file. We have the controllers, and let's add the packages which we will use for our API. Let's add the packages which we will be using for our API, and the packages are as follows. So our first package would be just a minute guys, bear with me. Yes, it is Microsoft Entity Framework Core. So we'll be browsing it from here. Guys, how we can add the package? I just wanted to give you a little bit on it. So we can find it by, we'll select this project and we'll do a right click. On right click, we'll select the option of manage NuGet packages. Once we enter here, we can browse the packages from here. So I'll select Microsoft Entity Framework Core. So we require Entity Framework Core. Let it get loaded. So Entity Framework Core. Let's select it, copy. Okay. So this package we require. Since we are using the .NET 6.0 version, I'll use the 6.0 version of Entity Framework Core, and I'll select this and I'll install it. We'll accept, and yes, it is installed in our API. Next thing what we require is we'll again go to our NuGet package, and here we will require a SQL server. So I'll select the SQL server. We'll copy it and we'll paste. And yes, SQL server again. I will select SQL server. As usual, since we are using 6.0.1 version for the .NET, we will use 6.0.1 version of this particular package. We'll install it, we'll accept, and our data is installed. Guys, why we are using the downgrading version? Since we are using .NET version of 6.0, the Entity Framework version of 6.0 is compatible with this version. If we use the higher version, there can be some incompatibility issues and the package might not behave as per the expected format. So our next package which we want is of Entity Framework Core Tools. I'll add that as well. And again, the version we will use the downgraded one, 6.0.1. Install this and I'll accept it, and that's it guys. We don't require any more packages for this version. Let's close all the tab. Let's close this NuGet. Everything is added. Now we'll create a folder for models where we will create the employee model. So we'll create the folder, we'll call it as model, and in the model we'll create a class, and this class we will be calling as employee, and we will add it in the employee. We will create the getters and setters of the model. So our employee would be will look like public int employee ID, and we'll do a getter setter. Then we will create a public int employee name. Then sorry, it will be a string, not int. We'll do a public string employee name, and then our other feature would be, let's say, public string address. We'll do a getter setter, and lastly we'll do public string department. Will generate our getter setter. Okay. Once we create this, then we'll create one more folder, and we will call that folder as data. And in the data, we will create our DB context. So we'll create a folder. We'll add a new folder. We'll name it as data. And in data, we will create our DB context class. So we'll add a class. We will call it employee DB context. Here we will use inheritance of the DB context class of Entity Framework Core, and we will extend our employee DB context with the DB context class of Entity Framework Core. Let's do it. DB context, and we'll import the required package. After importing it, we will create a constructor of this particular employee DB context, and in the DB context we will inherit it with the base properties of the DB context options and classes. DB context options, right? And in the options we will pass our employee DB context, employee DB context, and we will pass the options in here, and then we will inherit this constructor with the base options. That's it. After that, we will declare our DB set of employee class. Let's do it. Public DB set, and in the DB set we will pass our employee, and in employee we will, okay, and in employee we will create employees of DB set type and we will generate the getter setter. That's it guys, our DB context class is created. Our next step would be to enable in our program.cs, we will add this DB context and we will add the service to our container, and this will be done like builder dot services dot add DB context, and in this DB context we will provide our employee DB context which we have created, employee DB context, and in this context class we will provide the options, and options will be to use SQL Server, options.use SQL Server, and here we will pass builder dot get builder dot configuration dot get connection string, and in the connection string we will pass our connection string which we will define okay. This connection string we have to pass, and in this connection strings we have to define in our app settings.json. So our connection string will be defined here in the JSON format, wherein I will declare connection strings, and that connection string I have to pass in here. Let's call it con, and this will be our server which is the local machine, so we can use dot for that. Dot signifies our local machine, then we will specify the database. Let's call it emp underscore db. Okay, then I will pass trusted connection as true, and then I will pass trust server certificate as true. Trusted connection is true, trust server certificate as true. Okay, everything is created in here. Let's save everything, and in our program.cs file we will pass in get connection string, we will pass the value of on. Okay. Our next step is to run the commands in our package manager console to create the tables and the respective database. without wasting much of time, let's run our commands. Okay, we'll open our package manager console and let's check our Microsoft SQL Server. Okay, let's connect it. Let's create a new database. Let's call it as we defined in our project previously. Let's call it settings.json. Let's call it empdb. New database. We'll call it emp underscore db. Let's check. Let's cross verify it again. Yes. And we'll create okay. empdb is created, and then we will run our commands in package manager. I hope it is visible to you guys. Okay. So our first command will be add migration. We call it initial create. Okay. And our migration is created, and we'll say update database. And you can see our command has run successfully. Let's check whether the data, let's refresh our, let's check for tables, and yes, our employee table is created. Guys, this is how we can use the code first approach in Entity Framework Core and create a simple table. So let's insert some values in our employee. So I'll call employee name as, let's say I'll call it Aman. I'll give the address as Gopalpur, and I will give the department as in IT. Our next record will be Salma, and her address is Delhi, and she's a lawyer. So I'll call it law. Then our next record will be Salim. Salim lives in Mumbai and he is working in marketing. So I'll give it as marketing. So I guess these many data will be sufficient to fetch. And let's do a select top 1000 rows. And guys, our data is inserted as well. So without wasting much of time, let's code our controller. So I'll close this package manager console. There are two commands which I have used, which is add migration initial create, and then once this migration is created, we have used our next command, which is database update, which is update database. So database is updated as well, Let's close this. This is our initial create migrations file. You can check it how a migration creates a table. Let's open our controller file, and in controller we will add a C# class and we'll call it employee controller. We add our class is added, and let's code our controller. So in order to code our controller, we'll extend it with controller base. Okay. After extending it with the controller, we'll give the annotations of route. The route will be of API slash, and here we will pass our controller, and then we will give another annotation of API controller. Now we will be using our DB context, employee DB context class, which we created in here, and we will use dependency injection to inject the context class in this controller. So let's see how we can do that. Private read only employee DB context, and let's call it as context, and let's import the necessary namespace which is required. So we'll import. After that we will create the constructor for this employee controller, and in this constructor we will pass the parameter of employee DB context, and we'll call it context. Once we pass this parameter, we will inject the property. Guys, this is how we inject the properties, by assigning the parameter value to the read-only value in the constructor. So let's write our first method which we want our API to do is to get all employees. So we will be using the HTTP GET annotation, which will signify a GET request. Then we will write our method using public async task, and we will specify the task as iActionResult, and then we will name this method as get students. Sorry, we'll call it get employees. So get employee will get the value of each and every employee. How we can do it? It's very simple. We'll create a var type of employee. In this var type of employee, we will first use await. Since we have used async here, we have to use await, and then we will use our context, and then from this context we will be using employees, and in this employees we will do the toList async. toList async which will return and then we will return the status code of OK, along with we will pass the employees. This is a simple request which will return our employees present in our database. Our next method will be getting employees with ID. So I will use again HTTP get here, and in HTTP get I will pass an ID. We have to pass a ID to our request query, and then we will write our respective method, and we'll call it get employees by ID. Okay. Or simply we can also use get employees. It won't be ambiguous since our first method is not expecting any parameter, and in get employees int ID we are passing a parameter of ID, so that will avoid the ambiguous step. So again here we will create a var employee, and this employee will again use await, and in the await I will pass our context, and context will be of again employees, and we will do find async. So find async we will pass our ID. So first we will find that particular employee whose ID is being passed in our endpoint, and after finding that employee, we'll provide one small validation. Let's say if employee is null, then we will return not found. Else we will return OK, and we will pass that particular employee. So our two methods is written. One is get employee, other is get employee by ID. Our next would be to create an employee. Here we will use the post request to create that particular employee. We will use HTTP post. We will write public async task action result, and we will call it as create employees. So create employee we will call, and in create employee what we will do is basically we will be passing a employee type. We will pass the employee in here, employee model here which we want to create, and then simply we will use our context. Sorry, we'll use our context, and in this particular context of employees we'll add that model which we have passed through our front end. Once we create it, we'll use await, and then we will use context, save changes async, and then we will return OK along with the body of the employees which we have passed to create. So our create employee is created. Our next method will be of update. HTTP, let's say we'll use put, and in put we will pass an ID, and in ID we will again create a method async task action result, and it will be an update employee. So what it will basically do is we will pass two arguments to this method. One is of ID type. Here we will pass the ID of the employee which we tend to update, and then we will pass the employee model. This employee model will contain the data of which we want to update. The updated data will be contained in this particular parameter which we will be passing from the client, and once we use the front end we will pass it through the front end. So what exactly we will do is we will create a where, and we will call it existing employee, and existing employee we will call it first. We will find await, then we will find, and in find async we will pass the ID. Then we will apply a small validation from our backend side, wherein we will check this particular existing employee. If the value is null, then we will simply return a bad request. Okay. We will simply return a bad request. Else if it is not null, we'll simply change the values. So let's say we'll change the employee name to our employee which we are passing. Then we will change the other thing which is department to whatever we are passing, and then we'll change the third field which is address to whatever we are passing. Once we pass all this data from our side, then we will save the changes, which is the changes gets saved after calling save changes method. So since we are using the async part, we have to use await first, and then we have to call this save changes async. And after we have saved the changes, we will return OK, and in OK we will pass the data which we have returned. So we'll pass our employee. Our next method will be the delete method. It is very simple. We will use HTTP delete, and delete also we require ID because ID specifies which record we want to delete. So we'll use public async, and then we will use a task, and we will use I action result, and we will call this method as delete employee. We'll call this method as delete employee, and in delete employee we will pass our ID which will be of integer type, and then again we will use where employee, and then we will check for find async using the context. First we will find that particular employee, and it will be done by using find async method. Async Once we find that particular employee, we will check for the null. If that particular record is null, we will simply return a bad request, or we will return not found. We can also return not found, the 404. Once we do that, then we will use context dot employees dot remove, and in remove we will pass this particular employee we want to remove. Once we do that, save changes. After that, we'll use await, and here also we require to use await, and we will call it save changes async, and then we will return a status code of OK. That's it, guys. Our API development is completed. Okay. So we have created this REST API. We have used the entity framework code and code first approach to create this REST API. We are moving to a third step where we will be testing it with Swagger. So let's run this particular project. Okay. Our project is run, and we are using this particular yeah. So you can see here, guys, our project is run, and let's do a dual screen so that you guys can see the okay. So what I will do is I will expand it. Yes, I hope my split screen is visible clearly, and we have this table dbo.employees where we are working with the data in here. So our first will be to get the employees, get all employees. So we'll try it out. We'll execute, and guys, our data is returned in the specific format which we were expecting. So our first method has passed manually. Our next method is it was get employee by ID. So I'll try that out first, and then we'll use the ID. Let's say I want to fetch ID1, which is, again, I'll execute the data, and yes, our ID1 is returned as we were expecting. Our next we have three more methods to test, which is again post. In post we have to try it out. I'll remove the ID column, and in employee name I will pass it as, let's say, Ashish, and then address I want, let's say, I'll call it Ashish is from, let's say, Durgapur, and next is our department, which is, let's say, Ashish works in testing, so I'll call it software testing to provide a precise, and then I will execute this particular post request. So our data is created. Let's check whether it is created in our database or not. So guys, you can see here this particular data is created in database as well. Now our next request which we want is of put. So I'll try that out first, and then let's say I want to modify Ashish only. So in Ashish, what I want to do is I want his name to be Ashish, and I'll use Mandal as his second name. Second is address. I'll make it New Durgapur. And software testing department looks a little longer, so I will just make it short as IT. Works in IT sector. So let's just execute this request and check whether the data gets updated or not. So I will execute it. And yes, our data is updated here. Let's check in our database. So yes, Ashish Mandal, New Durgapur, IT. Data is updated in our put request. Lastly, we have one more request left, which is delete. Let's say I'll try this out and I want to delete ID4. So I'll simply pass the ID4 and then I'll execute this. And it's giving us a 200 success. Let's check whether that particular ID is deleted or not. Let's select it. And yes, ID4 is deleted, guys. So our manual testing part is also completed. Our last part is we want to write our testing framework in here. So whatever we did in manually to test these 5 methods, we will write a testing method in RestSharp where we will delete whatever we executed manually here. Our scripts will execute that particular step for us. So this is part of automation testing in API. So let's write that particular framework, which is the last part of our video. So I'll minimize everything. I'll stop this API, and I will create our next project for API testing. So this employee API is there. Again, we will create a new project. So we'll go file, new, we'll create a project. In this project, we will select a template of unit test project. Okay, so we'll do next. In unit test project, we will call it employee REST API automation. So for REST API automation, we are using RestSharp. So we'll do a next, and again we will be using a .NET 6.0 version for this also. We'll create this particular project. So our project is created. I will add all the packages which we will be using for this particular project. Let's do it. So just a minute, guys. So yeah, I'll add the packages first. So we have Microsoft test and unit cover collector. So we need 2 packages for this particular project. First we need our RestSharp. So let's go and do manage NuGet packages. In manage NuGet packages, we will select RestSharp. Okay, RestSharp, we will be using the latest version. This latest version is compatible with the .NET 6.0, so that's not a problem here. we'll install this particular package. And our next package which we require for creating this automation framework is Bogus. So I will use Bogus. Bogus is, guys, this library you can check. This is basically used for generating fake data records. So manually, multiple times we don't need to type the data. We can use Bogus for the same. So Bogus we will install, and yes, Bogus is also installed. Let's check for yes. So we'll build our solution. Succeeded, no problem. And in here we will create a folder structure. One folder we will call it as let's call it as our endpoint. So I will add a new folder. I'll call it as endpoints. Okay, so endpoints. Okay, in endpoints we will create our class, and this class will be called as routes. Okay, let's change the class type to public from internal, and let's define our routes in here. So we will use public, and then we will use static. We'll use string and then base URL. In the base URL we will define the. So guys, we will be using the HTTP part rather than the HTTPS. Details I'll let you know why we are using HTTP. So since this is a local machine, HTTPS requires a lot of SSL certification validations to be updated. So in order to avoid and skip that part, we are using HTTP. HTTP is a little less secured, and since we are testing in our local machine only, so we can use HTTP. For creating this framework, I will use the HTTP localhost 5273 port for testing our API. So in this routes class, we will define our default endpoints. So employee endpoint will be there, and in employee endpoint we will define the common employee endpoint. So endpoint, and our REST API automation is one project. Let's open our other employee API automation as well, employee API as well. So we'll just yes, two tabs is opened. So yes, let's minimize this. So we'll define a common string, and we'll define a common employee endpoint, which will be called as employee, and then we will since this framework has only one entity, employee only, so here we have defined a common endpoint here, but we can add more endpoints, like let's say there is department, we can extend department and then add common department endpoint. And our next class which we will create in this framework, it will be let's say it will be the payload class. So payload again will contain a simple employee model. So our next will be, I'll add a new folder, I will call it as payload. And this payload will have another class here which we will call as employee. Okay, so we'll add it, and again we'll change the internal class type to public, and in the public we will add the data which we will be manipulating. So again it will be public string employee name, and we'll generate a getter setter. We don't require equal to, we just need getter setter for employee name. Then it will be string address. So let's check our how we have defined our model here. So it will be address and it will be department. Okay, address is small case, address, and then we'll generate a getter setter, and then we will be using public string, and then our next is department, and have a getter setter. So these three members are sufficient to manipulate the data. So we created the payload wherein in the payload we generated the getter setter for employee. Next is routes. In the endpoint we will create the employee endpoint class. So we'll create a class, we'll call it employee endpoint. Let's make it a public class. Public class. So our employee endpoint, it will contain two data of read-only type. First is we will declare a private read-only RestSharp, and we'll declare a client of RestSharp type. So let's input the necessary sorry, it will be REST client, not RestSharp, it will be REST client. So let's import, yes. So first we will declare a read-only type of REST client, then we will declare a read-only type of base URL. Read-only string, and we'll call it base URL. Okay. Then we will declare this employee endpoint constructor. In this constructor we will pass a parameter to string base URL, and then we will assign the value of this read-only base URL to the parameter we are passing here, and we will pass this base URL to the client in the constructor. So new REST client, and then we will pass our base URL. Okay. Now let's write the REST response method for creating, reading student, updating, for creating employees, reading employees by ID, updating employees, and deleting employees. So let's write that. I'm getting confused with employees and student, guys. So pardon me. Let's create our first method. So it will be public REST response, and then we will create a response, create our employee. Okay, so this employee, we will pass an employee type argument here. The employee will come from the payload. Yes, in this we will pass our employee, and in employee we will write our first we will declare a var of request type, and then we will write our new REST request. For this request will be an object of REST request class, and here we will pass our routes. So routes, let's say routes dot common employee endpoint, and method will be post, which we will be using in here. I mean, since it's a create of employee, I mean we are creating new employees, we will use post request here. Then in this request we will add the JSON body, and in the JSON body argument we will pass the employees argument. Then again we will create a response type of variable, and in this response type of variable, from the REST client we will execute the request of post. First we will call the client, then we will execute post, and in execute post we will pass the request which we have created above. And then since this method is of REST response type, we will return this particular response. So guys, this is how we can create an employee. Our next method will be to read students. So we'll create public REST response, and in REST response we will read employee. Again, I got confused between student and our employee. So we'll read the employee. How we will do that? We'll add a request or variable type. This will be an object of REST request type, and in the REST request we will pass our routes dot common employee endpoint, and this time since we are reading the data, this time the method is get. So we'll specify that. After that we'll declare a variable type of response, and we will execute the get request, and then we will return this particular response in here. Okay, so again our next REST response read let's call it read employee by ID. Let's call this method read employee by ID, and here I am passing my ID as an argument to this method. Then again we'll create the request type variable. We will assign it to new REST request, and then we'll pass. In this case, guys, we will be using string interpolation of C# to optimize the process. So basically, this dollar which we have used here, and then in this dollar we will pass a curly bracket, where curly bracket will specify the common employee endpoint, and after that we will specify our ID, and then we will specify this method as get. So guys, if you check it out here, we have used a common and routes.common employee endpoint. This will specify the route till employees. After that we tend to pass the ID. Here we are using string interpolation to pass the ID to complete the endpoint. And since this method is a get, we'll do that. Next line of code will be response, and it will be client dot execute get, and in a get we will pass our request, and then we will return this response. So in response, yes, we will just simply return the response. So 3 methods we have written. We have 2 more methods of update employees, and the other is of delete employees. Let's complete it. Use public REST response. And we will call it update employee. In update employee, we need to pass 2 arguments. One is ID and one is the employee body, which we tend to update. So we'll pass employee, and then we'll pass the employee type. Here we'll again declare the request, and we'll use the string interpolation of C# here as well. We'll declare a dollar, then we'll provide double semicolons, then we open curly bracket. In curly bracket we'll pass the routes common employee endpoint, and then we'll pass the ID, and then this method will be put. My device, this would be post, it will be put. So put method we will pass, then we will add our JSON body, and then we will execute the put method as a response. So we'll execute where is put, guys? Yeah, execute put method, and then we'll pass the request, and then we will return this response. Okay, last method which is left is delete. So we create one employee, we read the employees, we update the employees, and then lastly we will write a method to delete. So we'll use public REST response delete employee, and delete employee, we will pass one argument only, which is ID, which we want to delete. And then we will pass where request and new REST request. Again, we will be using string interpolation to pass the ID. Simple routes dot routes dot common employee endpoint, then method dot delete. Then we will execute the delete in the response of variable type, and then we will return it. So guys, our methods are written completely. Let's remove the unnecessary use of unnecessary unused namespaces. Let's remove that from our class. It is one of the best practices I think each and every developer should follow. So we have removed the unnecessary namespaces in our test class. Yes, let's remove it in the payload class as well. Okay. So our let's save it. Let's do a save all. Let's create one more folder called as tests, where we will be writing our test class. Let's do it. Let's add a new folder. Let's call it test. And in the test folder, we will write our tests. Let's call it employee test. Let's add a class. Let's call it employee tests. Okay. So we'll again make it a public class, and then we will start by declaring one faker. This faker, we will import the namespace bogus. Then again we will call our employee type here from the payload. Yes. Third thing which we want to declare is our employee endpoint class. Employee endpoints. We will import it from okay, we'll call it employee endpoint. We'll employee endpoint will have a employee endpoint, and we will use new employee endpoint type, and here we will pass our base URL, routes.base URL. Open it. Then we will use the setup annotation of .NET. This setup class will be called first before running any test. So in setup, we will create a new instance of Baker object. Then we will create a new instance of employee object. And then we will pass employee dot faker dot name dot first name to the employee dot, we'll pass it to employee dot employee name. Then our next field, let's import our setup from an unit framework. Let's remove unnecessary namespaces. Okay, we declared, let's declare another dot address equal to faker dot address dot street address, then employee dot department. In here we are using faker dot department faker. Let's use a company in place of department. Let's use company in place of department, and then we will call it company name. Okay. So in Faker, using Faker, we are assigning value to these employee types. After that, let's write our test. So our first test would be to get all employees. We'll write test order. Order 1 is generally used to specify the sequence of test. So since we have specified this particular test as order 1, so whenever we will be running this particular test class, the first test to get executed will be this particular test which we are coding right now. So we'll make it public void, and then we will call this test method as get employee, and we'll add var get employee response, and now we will be using our employee endpoint, and we will call read employee method, and then we will use assert to verify the status code of the particular test. So 200 will be returned. In case of reading employees, we'll use the int, will basically convert the status code, and get employee response dot status code, whatever we are getting, we will convert it to int type, and we will verify with assert r equal. Our next test will be test order 2, and this test will be public void get employee by ID, and here again we will, let's say we'll make it order 2, and we'll do a var. Let's check the record in our database. So I'll use 1. I'll return the 1 ID. So get employee by ID, and here we will use read employee by ID. So let's pass it as 1. So we want to fetch the records of we want to fetch the detail of employee with ID 1. So this method will return that particular result. Again, we will do assert dot r equal, and we will again pass 200 and we will use int typecast to convert the value. This is our second test. Our third test will create a particular employee record. So we'll write public void, we'll create an employee, and in creating the employee we'll type where, so it will be create employee response, and in here we'll say create employee, and in create employee we'll pass the employee type model object from which the faker has assigned the value. Once we create this particular record, we will run assert dot r equal, and create employee response dot status code and typecast. We have 2 more test methods left, guys. One will be of put and one will be of delete. Test order 5. So public void or update employee and then we will create another record in here. So what we will, before updating a particular employee record, let's say we will create a particular employee report. Here it will be for updating employee, the test steps will be different. So our first will be, we will create employee record first in order to update it. So we'll create an employee record first. How we will do, we'll write a where update employee, sorry, we'll call it where create employee response, and in this create employee response we will create one employee first. So we'll call our method create employee and we will pass our employee type here. Once we create this particular employee, we will store the coming in content of employee endpoint in a J object. So we will store employee response in the content. We will store employee response created. We will store created employee response content. Created employee response content in the J object. So what we will do, we will use J object, and with this J object we will call response object. So this J object, first let's import the necessary namespace, which is newtonsoft.linq. So in this J object we will again use J object dot, again we will parse it here, and in parse we will pass the employee content which we have received after creating the particular employee. So create employee response dot content. Once we create this particular J object parse, this response object will store the value of the created employee in a key value pair. So basically we will get a JSON object which will have a value stored in key value pair. So we'll have a we'll have an employee ID, and along with employee ID we will have the particular employee details like his name, his address, and his department stored in a key value pair. So our next step will be, we will assign values to employee payload using faker, or we also call it as bogus in C#. So what we will do, we will assign our values to the employee. So we will do employee in employee dot employee name, and in employee name we will pass the data from faker. So faker will be faker dot name dot first name. Okay, then we will use employee dot address, and in address we will pass our address as address dot, we'll pass, let's say we'll pass street address, and then our third data is employee dot department, and we will pass the department as, let's say we are using company to pass department, so we'll use company, no problem. So company name will be passed. Okay, so we have assigned the value to the employee. Our last step will be to update that particular record, update the created record above. Okay, so now again, in order to update it, we'll declare a where update employee response, and in this employee endpoint we will pass our method of update employee. Now update employee requires two arguments. In the first argument we will pass the integer of response object, and we will pass the created employee ID, and then we will pass our employee in here, and then we will use assert to check. And yes guys, so this is the 4 steps which we have to perform for the update while this test case. And the next is our delete test case. So for delete also we have a bit of extra steps added. So it will be order of, let's see, order of 3, and it will be order of 4, and lastly we will execute 5. So our last test case is delete test case. So let's write our delete test case. It will be public void delete employee in delete. Again we will create a employee record first to delete it. Next, let's create the record first. So we'll say where create, let's copy it from above guys. These two are common steps, so we will, let's copy it to avoid typing. So first we will create the employee. Okay. Once we create this particular employee, we will store the employee in response object. Why we will store in response object? In order to get the ID of the employee to delete. Now we will delete the above created records. Okay, so what we will do, we'll do a var, we'll do delete employee response, and in delete employee response we will pass employee endpoint dot delete employee, and in delete employee we will again typecast the type of response object, and here we will pass the employee ID which we want to delete, and then we will assert r equal 208 delete employee response. So this is the end of our test. So guys, we have written 5 test cases in here. 5 test cases include, first is the setup where we initialize the employee as well as the faker class, and we add values to the employee payload. So next is we get record, we get employee record, and then we get employee record by ID, then we create an employee, and then we update an employee, and then we delete an employee. These are the 5 test cases which we will be running. So before running these test cases, we have to make a little bit more changes in our employee API. So what we will do, we will go to our program.cs class, and the first change which we will be doing is we will enable course. So course basically what it does, it allows any header, allows any method, allow any origin to run our test methods which we have created in the test framework. In order to run that, we have to enable course. So how we can do that? I'm copying pasting code here guys. I'll explain you what it is here. So we are using app.useCourse. In the use course we have specified the builder container, and in the builder container we have enabled these methods of allow any header, allow any method, allow any origin. Our next thing which we want to disable here in this program .cs class of our API is we want to disable HTTP use HTTPS redirection. We want to disable this method. Why? Because in our test framework we are using HTTP, and if this HTTPS redirection is enabled, so whenever we will try to ping the HTTP whenever we will try to pick the HTTP from our RestSharp framework, it will get redirected to the HTTPS web address, and that will again cause the problems related to the SSL certification. So in order to skip that part, I'm using HTTP. So our tests are ready to get executed. Let's build our solution for the API. It is successfully built. Let's start our employee API. So our employee API is started. You can see here. Let's minimize this. Our database is opened, and we have these many records in here. Now let's build our test framework. This is our test framework. Let's build it. It is successfully built. Now in order to run tests, we will use Test Explorer. Test Explorer. So guys, you can check here. We have two test classes. This is the by default test class which we get for creating it. We can delete it, but I have not deleted it right now. We have 5 employee tests which we have written. Let's see. Let's execute our employee tests. So I'll execute this test. Let me close. And guys, all 5 tests which we have created have passed. So just in order to show you whether the particular test which we executed is passed or not, I will do a select top 1000 rows. And guys, you can check here, there are address added, there are departments added, and there are names added and to the particular. So in these 2 cases where we are creating record, we are updating record, everything is working as expected. Let's run these tests 3-4 times in order to check whether the created test is stabilized or not. So I'll run these tests again. And yes, let's check if extra record is added to our employees table or not. So guys, yes, as you can see, our script test of REST API automation are running perfectly fine. We have tested it manually as well. Manually it is also working fine. And that's it for today, guys. This RestSharp automation framework can be made more efficient and advanced. We can use logs, we can use the HTML report integration to this framework. I will be covering those parts in the coming videos. For getting such latest contents to my please stay tuned to my YouTube channel, support my channel. If you do like the content, please consider subscribing, and thank you. That's it for today.